they always miss the cultural nuances. So you'll have hallucinations and you're being told, this name sounds African. And then you're like, what language is it? And then you realize there's no language. It's just a bunch of syllables put together. And this is an experience I recently had. I laughed so hard because it sounded familiar in my language. And then when I asked where it's from, it was just like, it sounded like it's African.
What's the point of training AI models on different languages if we're not even listening to the people who speak them? The India AI Impact Summit is leaning in hard on concepts that are important, but also often co-opted. So in partnership with AI Now and the Aapti Institute, we've produced a series of interviews with some incredible people who live and breathe actual substance analysis and meaningful actions into these concepts. And in this interview, I'm talking with Chenai Chair about linguistic diversity. Chenai is a digital policy expert focused on how technologies can be more inclusive. She's the founder of My Data Rights Africa and director of the Masakhane African Languages Hub. So let's get into it. Every time there's one of these summits where all of these world leaders get in a room with industry, with civil society, there's lots of concepts that get bandied about as part of that political discussion. And it kind of changes what words and terms and concepts people seem to be interested in. And one of the key ones this year is going to be focused on multilingual AI or linguistic diversity in the context of AI, in the hopes of, I guess, kind of globalizing access to new technologies and making it less hegemonically English. But you work on these topics and I think have a much more sophisticated understanding of what this actually means. So do you want to talk a little bit about why linguistic diversity is kind of this hot topic or issue within AI? And then we can dig in a little bit more into what people should be thinking about or knowing about in terms of how we manage the politics around some of these AI systems and language.
To kick off, it's basically governments catching up. Entities catching up. People have known the importance of actually being able to access technologies in their own languages. A lot of people who do not speak the most recognized languages, like your European languages and your American languages, and I mean American like popular languages, have always wanted to have their own languages recognized. That's why there were efforts where people were kind of like really fighting to think about how did they create data sets of their own languages. And our argument 5 years ago was that tech companies have the data, they just don't simply care for the markets. Now the market is opening up. So what we're seeing is that reaction of like, oh, no person left behind, as we saw with the internet for all, with the mobile phones for development movement. Now we're here in the next phase of development, which is about creating tools and resources and technologies that everyone can actually make use of beyond being able to speak one of the most dominant languages, which is either English, French, Portuguese, or Spanish.
The potential political pitfalls of some of this, when governments, when companies, when even civil society gets engaged in these types of questions, and you get that kind of energy and momentum around this subject in something like a summit. What do you think are the potential political sort of pitfalls when thinking about this trajectory of investing in multilingual AI?
The potential political pitfalls are often sort of thinking about we are moving towards another level of data, which is language, and language is also personal identity. To what extent are we thinking about the safeguards involved with actually curating this data? And what's the point of value extraction that's happening for the people who are actually then providing these language data sets in their own languages? Are they the ones who are actually then building the technologies? And then also kind of like thinking about the issues of, are we going to have this rush to have these data sets that may actually lead to heighten already existing political tensions in those countries when certain languages are prioritized over the others? And that's why we've seen the success of small community entities actually seeing their languages, because maybe the governments wouldn't have invested in them, but they wanted to see their own languages digitized, hence that importance and value of ensuring that there are multiple players at the table who are actually doing the work. And then another thing often is we see, like I mentioned, some people started doing this work a long time ago. There's the oversight of those communities now in the decision-making process and the governance of the work. They may not have access to these rooms because they may not be able to get a visa to come in time. They may not be able to afford the flight. So it's also that question of who actually is being included for the people who've always been doing the work and who's now taking up that center stage. So that I think has been the significant issue around language creation. And then of course, we exist in contexts where there may be increased harms, such as increased surveillance, because now people can better understand how people are talking in their languages. And that's a key issue. And then also, sort of like, what are the regulatory safeguards? We're still existing in the context where some people have not refined their data protection laws or their access to information acts. So people are having this data collected, but they actually are not sure what it's going to be used for. Yet there is value in if people are voluntarily with consent participating in the design of the systems, because then they can be able to communicate with their devices in the language of choice.
Super interesting. Well said. Okay, so there is a risk also that I imagine that when languages get kind of vacuumed up by the existing structure we have with large language models, where you have a couple of companies that have access to tremendous amounts of data, tremendous amounts of compute, all the energy and water drain that goes along with that, that they essentially recognize, as you said at the beginning, a market that they want to pursue. And so they just hoover up another language data set and incorporate that language into their models. I imagine that's not what you envision. What do you think about this being done well? Do you want to talk a little bit about what it could look like to be able to represent multiple languages in models, but without using colonial practices and this kind of empirical or empire top-down kind of way of working?
That's one of the reasons why Masakhane African Languages Hub was set up. And Masakhane African Languages Hub does come from the wider Masakhane community of people who were doing things by the bootstraps, because they were rejected in rooms because the people were like, what do you mean African languages have some form of intelligence and they can be written about? So that stands as an example. Like, you just have to look at global majority people who are often excluded in spaces. The tenacity to actually say, hey, I want to hack the system and I want to see my language represented. And then so what we see there is more sort of like a community-led grassroots approach to creating these data sets. The significant challenge there, of course, that it's not sustainable to always keep everything at community level. So there's a need to have multiple players in the room. There are over 2,000 languages on the African continent, and they are evolving. Some are dying off, but they're evolving. It cannot be done by one entity. So you have to think about how many players can be involved in the space. Who do we need to think about? Having the multi-stakeholder approach, having linguists, sociologists, the actual community of speakers, entities interested in education, for example, because not a lot of countries actually use their own whole mother tongue languages for education. So we've already got use cases ready in play, but then it's a matter of that there needs to be multiple players who are contributing it to it. We need government advocacy or government positions that allow for the creation of access to data sets. We need to have private sector that are actually African private sector players as well, actually contributing to ensure that the chain itself, the value chain, is homegrown and is invested into creating the use cases that people can apply the data set, so that people are not just data set collectors, but they're actually seeing tools and resources coming out, which is some of the work that we're doing. It's actually being able to evaluate the language data sets that are created by the people who are hooving up all of this data to see if they really work. Because the significant thing is that they always miss the cultural nuances. So you'll have hallucinations and you're being told, this name sounds African, and then you're like, what language is it? And then you realize there's no language. It's just a bunch of syllables put together. And this is an experience I recently had making use of an Gen AI platform. And I laughed so hard because it sounded familiar in my language. And then when I asked where it's from, it was just like, it sounded like it's African. So those are
Oh my
the,
God.
so those are the realities of like bringing everyone to the table. And then also thinking about a sustainability approach, which is, of course, right now there is increased investment from the funding community, which is great. But as in technology, we know these waves of funding do come in. But how do you create a sustainable community that is able to exist beyond just the crunch of resourcing? What are the business models that need to be in play? And there's so much talent on the continent that it's sort of like creating a cohesive ecosystem, which is part of Masakane's goal and mission, to have this enabling environment and ask people together to think about how do we make sure, as the research is being done in university institutions, it can also be translated into marketplace and into industry and into ecosystem as well.
What happens if they don't want their language to be digitized? Have you seen examples of that? Or do you guys have a viewpoint on what should happen if that's the case?
Yeah, I have seen examples of some people, I'm just trying to remember which language it was, where they didn't want to have the language digitized. And so then that actually creates the nuance of intergenerational struggles and cultural issues. This is the part where we take out big tech and we actually think about the social norms at hand. So you may find that, for example, younger people are interested in collecting their languages because they're like, this is the way that I'll connect to my family. And then you may have older members of the language community actually saying absolutely not, because they may be afraid that, I remember doing this one project where someone was like, if you take my voice, it can be used for witchcraft. And that's a valid point, right? Because that's a cultural understanding and an issue. So in those instances, we have often said that for languages that are created, if there's a community that actually says they don't want their data to be digitized, it has to be recorded and it has to be clear. But it does create a vacuum of governance because you'll have the push of it's important for the language to be digitized. And then you have people saying, but I'd rather not. It's also a means of protection of our community and of self. I don't have the answer, which is to say that this is something that we're constantly in conversation and awareness of, because we often ask ourselves who actually does own the language, like who gives us the permission. And that's why there's a need to have the state recognized language councils as part of the conversations, but actually going into communities and figuring out, what is the accepted means of getting people's buy-in, and also doing a lot of the work of the explanation of why it's of value if people are curious about it, but if people are not interested, and then you have to acknowledge that that's not going to happen.
It makes perfect sense that there would be kind of age dividing lines in terms of level of comfort and also memory of empire. Because I imagine older people are like, I don't think we want to trust these people, which I feel like is also a very legitimate, hopefully helpful reminder. Are there any practices you're seeing that where communities are asserting control over their languages that you think are interesting, or sort of thoughts on how a community can assert control over their language? Are there other aspects of control or governance that you've seen that you think are good?
I think to start off with around issues around licensing. So some communities have been thinking about what's the right license model that they can use. So you'll find, for example, that on the continent in Africa, there's been the license created called SA2. This was created by Lelapa AI. I forgotten who they worked with. But the idea around that was thinking about like what is the right licensing framework that works for us. Then there was also Noodle that was created in collaboration between Strathmore and Center for Data Science well, the researchers are Dr. Chijoki and Dr. Melissa Omino. And so the idea was then how do you then create like an open license that gives preference to people developing on the continent first so that they can have a leg up. And then if anyone's going to use the data, how do they pay back into the ecosystem? So that's one example. And then another example on that is, say, for example, you find Mozilla's data collective, where people then are able to decide which tier they're going to put their data onto that platform. And so then that's one of the aspects there. And then beyond sort of like licensing, it's also trying to map out who needs to be involved in the conversations. So particularly a lot of developmental interventions are trying to address the gender digital divide. So increasing access to information by having tools in languages and in voices that are not predominantly identified as male. That creates also kind of like a social issue where sometimes when people are going into communities to collect this data, there may be patriarchal norms that prevent women from interacting with these platforms or interacting in these spaces. So there's a need to have everybody in the room to figure out how do we actually have buy-in and who are the people, it's not just the linguist that you have to have in the room. You have to go talk to the chief or the village headman who determines that, yes, sign off on this exercise. Then you also have issues around accessibility. So speech impediments, disability, how do you account for that in the actual data sets that are being created? And that requires working with people who already work on disability issues. It cannot just be the technologists who are creating these data sets without for kind of like standard speech. We have to actually recognize that there's a diversity in the way that people speak. So there has been, I think, University of Ghana actually partnered with Google, if I'm not mistaken, but they have done research and actually collecting data sets for people with differences in speech, not standard speech, as a way to then have these robust technologies that can understand the difference in the way that people speak. So for this to be done, it's really taking into account building for difference than building for what is considered like a normal or central unit.
I also think the gender data representation is really interesting and something I hadn't really thought about how that would affect the pool of data available to make models. And then that would affect the output in terms of the quality of male voices versus female voices, for example. That's really interesting. Okay, so there's obviously possible opportunities for global majority solidarity on some of these things because language diversity, I imagine, is much higher in global majority countries than in the global north because empires be empire in their home in their home countries. But when you think about there's obviously those opportunities for solidarity in global majority countries, which I love to hear a little bit about what you see in terms of who are your counterparts in other parts of the world. But then also there's probably things that need to be worked out at like the national or the kind of regional level. Do you want to talk a little bit about how solidarity and political organizing is showing up geographically in different ways around these issues?
Yeah, so that's kind of like the big thing. And talking about those people who started doing it 5 years ago, the idea being that, like, how do we build on what's already there? So, for example, before Masakhane, there was Lacuna funds that worked across the global majority. So we are part of the people who've continued the work with Lacuna funds to actually then figure out where do those data sets exist? How do we make sure that they're accessible to people? And so if a project sunsets, how do you ensure that it continues to exist even if the funding period has ended? So that's one way of thinking about collaboration. The other is in exchanging tools and knowledge. So we don't have to redesign everything, but it's figuring out what are the resources that are currently out there and then how do we share it with the wider community. So for Masakhane Research Foundation, we have community calls every month where people actually highlight what they're working on, and that's where collaborations come from and they build up that entity. And those collaborations sometimes are institutional or they are global, thinking about the diasporic effect of people where people are, based studying in the US and they've got colleagues in Africa. They may have access to higher resourcing because they're in the US. How do you make sure that there's that transference of skills? And then, of course, there's also the funding element. For example, Masakhane has been funded by collaborative funders, commitment of funding. And so then that's the idea of now the funders are taking into account the idea that we can't just be splitting people doing this work. How do we pull the funds together so that people can work together in that way? And so for us as our role as well as Masakhane is then to interact with entities like Course in India or Sea Lion and ETH in Zurich, for example, to figure out how have they done the work that they're doing and how can we not fall into failings that other people have done before. And then at a governmental level, there has been intergovernmental organizations under the United Nations who are trying to get governments to actually start committing to investing in building up the necessary infrastructure to collect languages. And so then what we have seen there is that Masakhane will exist maybe as an example of what it means for people who are already doing the work so that there's none of this idea that there's no one who's doing it, we don't have capacity. We've been in conversations with some government institutions who are basically asking how do we build up our language, and then we're able to actually show that there is already an existing community from Masakhane who is already in your country doing this work. So you don't have to think you're starting from somewhere else, but you're bringing visibility into that. So that's been some of the thinkings around how do we create collaborations, how do we spotlight each other, and how do we pull resources? Because at the end of the day, it is quite expensive to collect these data sets. And, with everything that starts off as being expensive, I hope that it does get more affordable down the line for people to have their languages digitized and available and build off of those platforms. So that is the thinking we're trying to do, especially around institutional capacity building, that we often say we go far together. So that is the ethos that we put forward when we're thinking about collaboration and working together in all of this work.
I love it. I mean, it's basically saying this is a pluralistic challenge where lots of people approach different things in different ways, but there must be sufficient shared technical challenges, governance challenges, political questions that are enough aligned and enough similar that you can actually be efficient and collaborative at that level, even if the ultimate sort of way that it engages with a particular language is different. Okay, well, my last question is maybe a mean one. What's your most ungenerous interpretation as to why in a summit this topic becomes of such hot interest. Any reflections on why it might be a topic that's come up so much?
So with each and every new technological development and each and every new hot topic, particularly around in the development ecosystem, I'm always like, follow the money. Follow the money, you will actually then see sort of why is there this investment. And that's when we're able to see who's going to be the most sustained player in the ecosystem. Who are the people who were there right from the beginning? When people were talking about AI in pre-COVID, we were being laughed out of rooms, particularly on the African continent, because people were like, we have a digital access issue. Now it is 2026. All of a sudden, it's sort of like hot topic. Everybody has to be in the room. Let's talk about it. Follow the money to see what is driving this investment. And then hopefully the money is going to the right people in the right places.
Follow the money is always good advice when you're wondering about motivations. Thank you so much. This is really, I think, a tremendous amount of depth on a topic that I think will probably be mentioned a lot, but maybe not explored at this level. And I think the work that you're doing is really wonderful. This is really great. Thank you for making the time to talk. Thanks again to Chenai for joining me for this conversation. And as a reminder, this episode is part of a series we're doing in partnership with AI Now and the Aapti Institute called Reframing Impact, AI Summit 2026. We've got interviews with some incredible guests, and you can find all the series on our YouTube channel, so go check it out.